The storm and the stranger. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the old wooden cabin like an angry beast. Thick raindrops slammed against the windows, turning the world outside into a dark, blurry mess. Inside, an old man sat by the crackling fireplace, a thick wool blanket draped over his shoulders. Jack Carter had lived alone for many years. His cabin, hidden deep in the forest, was far from the city. He liked the quiet. No people, no trouble, just him, his old dog Max, and the sound of nature. But tonight, nature was angry. Thunder roared like a giant's growl, shaking the walls. Jack glanced at Max, who lay curled up near the fire, ears twitching at every loud boom. Then, a sound broke through the storm. A knock. Jack frowned. Who could be knocking at his door in the middle of a storm? No one ever came this far into the woods. He wasn't expecting visitors. The knock came again, weak and urgent. Jack grabbed the shotgun leaning against the wall. He wasn't a man to take chances. Slowly, he stepped toward the door. "Who's there?" he called, but the storm swallowed his voice. No answer. Jack hesitated. His old bones told him this was trouble. But something deep inside, a feeling he couldn't explain, made him unlock the door. The wind pushed it open with a loud creak. And there, standing in the freezing rain, was a girl. She looked no older than 16. Her clothes were torn, strange silver fabric clinging to her thin frame. Her skin was pale, almost glowing under the lightning's flash. Long, dark hair clung to her face, dripping with rain. But it was her eyes that made Jack's breath catch. They were large, too large for a normal human. And they shone, not from fear, but something else. Something unnatural. The girl swayed on her feet. Then, before Jack could react, she collapsed. Jack cursed under his breath. He had no idea who she was, but one thing was clear: she was freezing to death. He bent down, touching her wrist. Her skin was ice cold. Too cold. Max walked over, sniffing the girl, then whined. The old dog had seen many strangers before, but this time, he backed away. Jack's mind screamed at him to close the door, to leave her. This wasn't his problem. But his heart whispered otherwise. With a sigh, he lifted the girl into his arms. She was lighter than she looked. Carefully, he carried her inside and shut the door, locking it tight. Jack placed the girl near the fire. He grabbed an old blanket, wrapping it around her trembling body. She was still breathing, but it was slow and weak. Max watched from a distance, ears low, tail stiff. Jack studied the girl. Her clothes weren't normal. The fabric was smooth, almost like liquid metal. He touched it, and for a moment, it felt warm, then cold, then warm again. "What in the world?" Jack muttered. The girl stirred. A soft moan escaped her lips. Her eyes fluttered open. Jack took a step back. Those glowing eyes locked onto him. The girl tried to sit up but winced, grabbing her side. Jack noticed a deep wound on her ribs. The cut looked strange, not like a knife wound, but like a burn. She looked at him, her lips moving, whispering something. The words were not English. Jack felt a chill crawl down his spine. He had heard many languages in his life, but this one was different. It didn't sound human. "I don't understand," he said. The girl blinked. Then, slowly, she reached out. Her fingers, thin and trembling, touched Jack's arm. And suddenly, Jack saw flashes of something. Not memories, not dreams, something else. A giant metal city, floating in the sky. A group of dark figures, chasing someone. A bright explosion. Pain. Fear. Running. Jack gasped and pulled away. The connection broke. The images vanished. His heart pounded. What the hell had just happened? The girl's breathing was heavy. She looked at him, eyes filled with something close to pleading. Jack knew what she wanted. She needed help. But helping a lost human girl was one thing. Helping a girl who wasn't quite human, That was something else. Jack sighed and ran a hand through his graying hair. He should throw her out. He should lock the door and forget any of this happened. But as he looked at her, scared, weak, alone, he knew he couldn't. "All right," he muttered, "just for tonight." He stood up, checked the locks, then grabbed a towel. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, Jack had no idea that his quiet life had just ended. For good. And outside the cabin, hidden in the trees, something else was watching, waiting. The hunt had begun. Visitors in the night. The storm had finally passed. The air smelled of damp earth and wet leaves. The wind had died down, leaving the night eerily still. But inside the small wooden cabin, Jack Carter felt anything but peace. He sat on his old armchair, watching the girl sleep. Her breathing had steadied, her skin no longer ice-cold, but the strange glow in her veins still pulsed faintly under her pale skin. Jack had seen a lot in his time. War, death, the worst of humanity. But this, a girl who could speak through visions, who wore clothes that felt alive. This was something else. Max, his old dog, lay curled by the fireplace, but his ears were twitching, his nose sniffing the air. He was restless. Jack could feel it too. Something was wrong. Then, a low hum vibrated through the floorboards. Jack's head snapped up. His heart pounded in his chest. He knew that sound. Not thunder. Not wind. Something else. The girl's eyes flew open. She sat up so fast Jack nearly reached for his shotgun. Her breathing was sharp and quick. She turned toward the window, eyes wide with terror. Jack followed her gaze. Through the trees, a light moved. A strange, smooth glow, not flickering like a flashlight, not swinging like lanterns. It floated, sweeping across the forest too perfectly. Jack's grip tightened on the armrest. This wasn't normal. The girl suddenly grabbed his arm. Tight, desperate. She shook her head violently, eyes begging. "Stay quiet." Jack swallowed hard. His body screamed to act, to fight, but something in the girl's gaze told him that wouldn't help. Then, footsteps. Not loud, not clumsy. Precise. Controlled. Moving through the wet leaves without making a sound. Jack barely breathed. He reached slowly under the coffee table, fingers finding the smooth, cold metal of his shotgun. Outside, the glowing light grew brighter. Closer. Then, a shape moved between the trees. Tall. Too tall. Jack's stomach twisted into a knot. It wasn't a man. It wasn't human. The girl's fingers dug into his arm. Jack felt her trembling. But her fear wasn't for herself. It was for him. Max let out a low warning growl. Jack snapped his fingers, silencing him. But it was too late. The light outside froze. Then, it turned, directly toward the cabin. Jack's blood ran cold. A second later, the knock came. A soft tap. Then another. Rhythmic. Calculated. Jack's grip on the shotgun tightened. Whoever, whatever, was outside. They knew he was in here. The girl was shaking now, clutching her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. The knock came again. Louder this time. Not asking. Demanding. Jack's mind raced. He had two choices. Answer the door. Risk everything. Stay silent. Hope they go away. But deep down he knew. They wouldn't leave. They were hunting. And the girl was the prey. Jack took a slow breath. Then, in one swift motion, he blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. The knocking stopped. Silence. Jack's heart pounded against his ribs. He shifted his weight slowly, creeping toward the window. He risked a peek through the curtains. His stomach dropped. There were more of them. At least 3 figures stood outside, half hidden in the trees. Their shapes were long, unnaturally thin. Their eyes, glowing red orbs, pierced through the darkness. They weren't blinking. They weren't even breathing. Jack's grip on the shotgun tightened, This wasn't a rescue team. This wasn't the government. This was something else. Then, one of them spoke, but the voice didn't come from its mouth. It came from everywhere. A mechanical, hollow whisper slipping into Jack's ears like smoke. "You have taken what does not belong to you." Jack's jaw clenched. The girl buried her face in her hands, shaking her head. She knew them. The voice came again. "Step outside. Surrender the fugitive. No harm will come to you." Jack exhaled through his nose, steadying himself, and then he did something stupid. He called their bluff. "What if I say no?" he said, voice firm. Silence. Then, the tallest figure stepped forward. A crackling sound filled the air. Something sharp, metallic extended from its arm, a long needle-like blade, dripping with a strange black fluid. It wasn't here to negotiate. The girl grabbed Jack's sleeve, her breath ragged with fear. She shook her head, eyes pleading. Jack understood. If he stepped outside, he wouldn't come back. The thing tilted its head, as if considering its next move. Jack could feel it now. The air itself had changed. Heavy. Wrong. They were waiting for him to make a mistake. He wouldn't give them one. Jack turned to the girl, whispering so low only she could hear. "Is there another way out?" She hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Jack made his choice. In one quick motion, he grabbed her wrist and bolted toward the back door. The second he moved, a high-pitched screech tore through the air. The things outside charged. The cabin shook as something heavy slammed against the front door. Wood splintered. A second hit, harder this time. They were breaking in. Jack threw open the back door. Cold night air rushed in. The girl leaped forward, her bare feet barely making a sound against the wet grass. Jack didn't look back. Because he didn't need to. He could feel them behind him. Chasing. Hunting. And they were fast. The truth begins to unfold. Jack ran faster than he had in years. His old boots splashed through the muddy forest floor, his breath coming in sharp, painful bursts. The girl was ahead of him, silent, fast, moving like a shadow. She knew this land better than he did, and Jack was just trying to keep up. Behind them, the hunters were coming. Not running, gliding. Jack risked a glance back and instantly regretted it. The tall, thin creatures moved unnaturally fast, their glowing red eyes cutting through the darkness like knives. They didn't stumble, didn't slow down, didn't breathe. A high-pitched screech split the air. One of them leaped, clearing at least 20 feet, its metal-clad limbs twisting in ways that made Jack's stomach churn. Not human. Not even close. Jack gritted his teeth. He wasn't dying today. Ahead, the girl suddenly skidded to a stop. She turned, pointing at something, an old half-buried drainage pipe leading into the hillside. Jack hesitated. It was small, barely wide enough for them to crawl through. The girl grabbed his sleeve and pulled. No choice. Jack dropped onto his stomach and shoved himself inside. The wet, metallic smell of rust filled his nostrils as he wriggled forward. The girl followed, her thin form slipping through like water. Behind them, the screeching stopped. Jack froze. Silence. Then, a soft, scraping sound. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears. He turned his head just slightly. A long, needle-like limb had reached into the pipe, searching, feeling. The girl bit her lip, pressing her hands over her mouth to keep from making a sound. The thing clicked. A slow, rhythmic sound. It was listening. Jack held his breath. The metal limbs scraped against the pipe's walls, getting closer. Jack's fingers twitched toward his shotgun. One shot in this tight space, and the sound would be deafening, maybe even kill them both. Then, the girl did something strange. She closed her eyes. A faint, glowing pulse moved beneath her skin. And then, the air inside the pipe shifted. For a moment, Jack felt nothing. No sound. No movement, like the entire world had been placed under a thick blanket of silence. The limbs stopped. Then, slowly, it withdrew. Jack didn't move, didn't speak. Even after the footsteps outside faded, he didn't trust it. Minutes passed. Finally, the girl exhaled. Her shoulders sagged, and the glow under her skin dimmed. Jack let out a breath of his own. What the hell was that? She looked at him, eyes tired but calm. And for the first time, Jack realized how different she truly was. Not just alien. Something more. Secrets in the firelight. They crawled through the pipe for what felt like forever, finally emerging into a dry, rocky ravine. Jack's lungs burned, but the girl barely looked winded. They walked in silence, their path lit only by the distant glow of the moon. The wind whispered through the trees, but Jack no longer trusted the silence. Eventually, they reached an old, abandoned hunting shack. Jack had used it years ago, before his body had grown stiff, before he had learned to live with loneliness. They ducked inside. Jack collapsed onto an overturned crate, rubbing his temples. "All right," he huffed. "Start talking." The girl hesitated. Jack sighed. "You can understand me, right?" A slow nod. "Then you better explain before I lose my damn mind." She swallowed, glancing toward the fire he had just lit. Then, with slow, careful movements, she reached into the dirt and began to draw. Jack watched as her fingers traced symbols, not words, but pictures. A massive city floating high above the ground. Strange, dark figures surrounding it. A smaller ship escaping, fire trailing behind it. Then, a crash. A lonely figure in the trees. Jack's stomach twisted. "You were on that ship." The girl nodded. "You crashed here." Another nod. Jack exhaled. Jesus. He ran a hand through his graying hair, his mind racing. "And those things chasing us." The girl hesitated. Then she drew them too. Jack felt sick just looking at the sketches. The figures had twisting limbs, elongated heads, and eyes that weren't eyes at all. Just endless, glowing pits. She drew something above them. A symbol. A mark. Jack didn't recognize it, but he understood its meaning instantly. War. Enemies. Hunters. Jack swallowed hard. "They're here for you." The girl didn't respond, but she didn't have to. Jack looked down at the crude drawings, then back at the girl. She was just a kid, alone, hunted, terrified. And yet, there was something powerful about her. Something ancient. Something dangerous. Jack's mind screamed at him to walk away. This wasn't his fight. This wasn't his problem. But deep in his gut, he already knew. He wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever. Because for the first time in years, Jack Carter had something worth fighting for. The hunt begins. The fire crackled softly inside the abandoned shack, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Jack sat on an overturned crate, shotgun resting across his lap, eyes locked onto the girl. She sat near the fire, knees pulled to her chest, staring into the flames. Her skin still pulsed faintly with that strange inner light, like something alive was flowing beneath her flesh. Jack had seen many things in his life. War, death, the slow, painful decay of everything he had once loved. But he had never seen anything like her. She was not human, and neither were the things hunting her. Jack sighed, rubbing a hand over his grizzled face. "All right, kid. Let's try this again." The girl turned her gaze toward him, those two large, too bright eyes, filled with something unreadable. Jack tapped the ground in front of her. "Tell me what I'm dealing with." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she placed her palm against the wooden floor. And the room changed. The air shimmered, as if heat were rising from the floorboards. The firelight bent and twisted, and suddenly, Jack wasn't in the shack anymore. He was floating. He saw a sky filled with fire, ships like enormous black daggers cutting through the stars. Cities crumbled. Towers collapsed in slow motion as explosions rippled through their foundations. Figures ran through the streets, their faces twisting in terror, beams that looked almost human but too perfect, too luminous. The sky cracked open. And then the hunters arrived. Jack felt his breath leave him as he saw them. Those same red-eyed creatures that had chased them through the forest, but larger, more monstrous. They descended from the heavens like demons, tearing through buildings with needle-thin arms that could slice through steel. Their movements were too fast, too precise. Like machines, but worse. Not just killers. Eradicators. And then the vision ended. The cabin returned. The fire crackled once more. The wind whispered through the cracks in the wooden walls. Jack stumbled back, knocking over a rusted lantern. His breathing was ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs. The girl was watching him with something close to guilt. Jack swallowed. His throat was dry. "That was your world, wasn't it?" She nodded. Jack let out a slow breath, trying to ignore the cold dread curling in his gut. "And those things, they wiped out your people." Another nod. Jack's grip tightened around his shotgun. Jesus Christ. He ran a hand through his graying hair, staring at the girl. "And now they're here." She hesitated, then gave a slow, solemn nod. Jack cursed under his breath. This wasn't just some alien kid on the run. This was something bigger. Something worse. Before he could say another word, Max, the old dog who had been silent this whole time, suddenly let out a low guttural growl. Jack's instincts kicked in. He snapped up his shotgun, eyes darting to the door. The girl tensed, her glowing veins pulsing brighter. Then Jack heard it, a sound he would never forget. A slow, deliberate knock. Not loud, not impatient, rhythmic, calculated, like something that already knew the answer. Jack felt his blood turn ice cold. They had found them. The standoff. Jack's mind raced. They had barely escaped last time. He couldn't run again, not without a plan. He looked at the girl. She was frozen in place, her breathing sharp and shallow. "Stay behind me," Jack whispered. She didn't move, didn't blink. The knock came again. Then a voice. It wasn't spoken. Not really. It slid into Jack's head, cold and sharp as a knife. "You cannot protect her." Jack's jaw clenched. The voice came again, smoother this time. Less of a threat, more of an offer. "Give her to us. Walk away. You will be spared." Jack inhaled sharply through his nose. "I don't think so." Silence. Then the door exploded inward. Jack barely had time to react before something long and metal shot toward him. He fired. The shotgun boomed in the tiny space, filling the shack with fire and thunder. The thing lurched backward, its glowing red eyes flickering. But it didn't go down. Jack only had time for one thought. That should have killed it. Then it moved. Faster than anything should be able to. Jack barely twisted away in time as a thin blade-like limb shot past his head, slicing into the wall behind him. The girl threw up her hands, and suddenly, the air itself shimmered. The creature froze mid-step, as if caught in an invisible grip. Jack watched, wide-eyed, as the girl's veins glowed brighter, her hands trembling. The creature screeched, not in pain, but in something close to confusion. Jack didn't hesitate. He fired again. The blast ripped through the thing's chest, sending it crumpling to the floor in a heap of twitching limbs. Jack exhaled sharply, heart hammering. But he had no time to recover. Because outside, more of them were coming. The girl grabbed his hand, eyes desperate. Jack nodded, breathing heavily. "All right, kid. I get it." They had to go. Now. Escape into the unknown. Jack threw open the back door. The girl hesitated, staring at the fallen creature on the ground. Jack grabbed her wrist. No time. She looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time, Jack realized what she was thinking. She didn't want to run. She wanted to fight. Jack's stomach turned. What had he gotten himself into? A piercing screech echoed through the trees, and Jack felt the air shift. They were already surrounded. The girl took a slow step forward, her hands trembling. The glow in her veins pulsed brighter. Jack held his breath. Then, her eyes turned completely white. The ground shook, and the hunters stopped moving. Jack stared in shock as the creatures stood frozen, their limbs twitching but unable to advance. The girl turned to Jack. Her voice, soft but firm, rang inside his head. "I am done running." Jack exhaled. Then, slowly, he raised his shotgun. "Well, kid," he smirked, "then let's give them hell." The escape. Jack had fought before. He had seen blood spill in wars fought on distant soil, had stared down the barrel of a gun more times than he cared to remember. He had lost friends, lost love, lost everything. But this was something else. The girl stood beside him, her small hands raised, veins pulsing with that strange silver-blue glow. And the hunters, the towering red-eyed nightmares that had been chasing them, had stopped, frozen. Their blade-like limbs twitched, their movements stuttering like broken machines. Their heads jerked from side to side, but they couldn't move forward. Jack didn't know what she had done. But for the first time, the hunters weren't in control. Jack glanced at her. "Whatever you're doing, kid, don't stop." Her lips parted slightly, her glowing eyes locked onto the creatures, as if holding them in place with sheer will. But her hands trembled. Her breathing was uneven. She was struggling. Jack's gut twisted. She couldn't hold them forever. And then, the tallest hunter tilted its head toward her. Jack felt the pressure in the air shift, and suddenly the girl gasped, stumbling backward as if something invisible had struck her. The spell broke. The hunters surged forward. "Run," Jack roared, grabbing the girl's wrist. They bolted into the woods, Jack pumping his old legs harder than he had in years. Behind them, the screeching started again, a sound that made the air feel wrong, like metal scraping against bone, like the sound of something that should not exist. Jack gritted his teeth. He could hear them moving, not running, but gliding, like shadows slipping between the trees, too fast, too smooth. The girl stumbled, exhaustion clear on her face. Jack grabbed her, keeping her upright. "Almost there," he lied. They weren't almost anywhere, but they had to keep moving. The broken bridge. The forest thinned. And then, Jack saw it, a deep ravine, cutting through the land like an old scar. The remains of a rusted bridge stretched across it, an old railroad crossing, half collapsed from years of neglect. Jack skidded to a stop, looking for another way. There wasn't one. Behind them, the trees shuddered. The hunters were close. Jack turned to the girl. "Can you do that thing again?" He waved a hand vaguely. The freezing trick. She clenched her jaw. "Not for long." Jack nodded, gripping his shotgun. "Then give me 5 seconds." Before she could argue, he spun on his heel and fired. The blast slammed into the closest hunter, sending it staggering backward. It didn't fall, but it hesitated. That was enough. Jack turned back. "Go. Now." The girl bolted across the bridge. The wood groaned under her weight, old planks cracking. Jack followed, heart hammering. A shriek behind him. He risked a glance back. One of the hunters leaped forward. It landed on the bridge behind them. The wood snapped. The bridge lurched. Jack felt his stomach drop. "Oh, hell." "Jump," he roared. The girl didn't hesitate. She leaped, farther than any human could. Jack didn't have that luxury. As the bridge gave way beneath him, he threw himself forward, fingers grasping for the ledge, and missed. For a split second, he was weightless. Then, a small hand grabbed his wrist. Jack slammed into the cliffside. Pain shot through his arm, but he didn't fall. The girl held onto him, her face contorted with effort. Jack could see the terror in her eyes. Not terror that she would fall, terror that he would. With a growl, Jack swung his other hand up, grasping a ledge. Together, they scrambled onto solid ground. The girl collapsed, panting. Jack turned, looking back at the ravine. The bridge was gone. And on the other side, the hunters stood motionless, watching. Their glowing red eyes locked onto them across the gap. But they didn't follow. Jack exhaled sharply. They couldn't. They weren't built for climbing. Or maybe they weren't allowed to. Jack didn't care. "We keep moving," he said. "Now." The girl hesitated, looking back at the creatures. Then, slowly, she nodded. They disappeared into the trees. A message in the sky. They walked for what felt like hours. Jack's body ached. His lungs burned. But the girl, she didn't complain, didn't stop. She was tougher than she looked. Finally, they reached a small, rocky hilltop. From there, Jack could see the world stretching out in every direction. A long, empty highway. Mountains in the distance, and far away, faint lights in the sky. Not stars. Not planes. Ships. Jack's gut twisted. "Your people?" The girl didn't answer. Jack looked at her. Her face was blank, but her hands were clenched into fists. Jack frowned. "You don't want them to find you, do you?" Still, she said nothing. But that silence told Jack everything. She wasn't just running from the hunters. She was running from her own people. Jack exhaled. He didn't know what the hell he had gotten himself into. But there was no turning back now. He glanced at the girl. "All right, kid," he said. "What's next?" She looked at him, eyes filled with something unreadable. And for the first time, she spoke. Not in visions, not in pictures, but in his language. Her voice was quiet, almost broken. "We hide." Jack gritted his teeth. Then he slung his shotgun over his shoulder and kept walking. Because whatever this fight was, he wasn't letting her face it alone. The final stand. The world was quiet. Too quiet. Jack and the girl crouched low behind a cluster of boulders, their breath slow, controlled. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, but something else lingered beneath it, the sharp metallic tang of ozone. Jack had been in enough fights to recognize it. The smell of energy weapons. They were being watched, hunted. The girl had barely spoken since they escaped the bridge. She sat beside him, knees pulled to her chest, staring up at the night sky. Her glowing veins had dimmed, but the tension in her shoulders told Jack that she felt them too. The hunters were still out there. They were waiting. Jack exhaled, checking his shotgun. 4 rounds left. Not nearly enough. He looked at the girl. "You got anything left in that bag of tricks?" She hesitated. Then, slowly, she shook her head. Jack cursed under his breath. They needed a plan. And they needed one now. The ambush. The attack came without warning. A low hum rippled through the air, a sound that made Jack's teeth ache, made his vision blur for just a second. Then, something crashed into the ground beside them. Dirt and rocks exploded upward as a massive black figure slammed down from above, landing with unnatural grace. Jack barely had time to raise his gun before it moved. The hunter lashed out with a razor-thin limb, slicing toward Jack's throat. He threw himself backward, rolling across the dirt just as the blade cut through the air where his head had been. The girl scrambled away, her hands glowing faintly, but she was weak. Jack could see it. They wouldn't make it out of this one by running. They had to fight. Jack raised his shotgun, but before he could fire, the hunter snapped its head toward him. And suddenly, Jack's body locked up. His arms, his legs, his breath, everything froze. The hunter had paralyzed him. Jack's heartbeat pounded in his skull. He could still see. He could still think. But he couldn't move. Not even to pull the trigger. The hunter slowly approached him, its glowing red eyes narrowing in what Jack could only describe as curiosity. It tilted its head. And then, in that same hollow mechanical voice, it spoke inside his mind. "You are irrelevant." Jack gritted his teeth, his muscles straining against the invisible force. But he couldn't break free. The hunter raised its blade-like arm. It was going to kill him. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Then, the girl screamed, and the world shattered. A pulse of raw, white-hot energy erupted from her body, slamming into the hunter like a shockwave. Jack was thrown backward, his limbs suddenly his own again. The hunter wasn't so lucky. The force lifted it off its feet and sent it flying across the clearing. It hit a tree with a sickening crack, its glowing eyes flickering. Jack gasped for breath, his muscles burning. He turned to the girl and froze. Her body was changing. Her veins, once glowing with soft, pulsing light, were now blazing white-hot. Her eyes, no longer just large and bright, had turned into two orbs of pure, searing light. The power was consuming her. Jack could see it, and she didn't care. She took a slow step forward. The hunter tried to rise. The girl raised her hand, and the creature exploded. Jack barely had time to shield his face before the hunter was reduced to nothing but shards of metal and mist. A cold silence followed. The girl stood there, breathing hard, her arms still trembling. Jack stared at her. She wasn't just some lost alien refugee. She wasn't just running. She was dangerous. And she knew it. The truth revealed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The girl's glowing eyes slowly dimmed, and she dropped to her knees, panting. Jack watched her, his grip still tight on his shotgun. He had just seen her rip a hunter apart with nothing but her mind. If she could do that, then why was she afraid? Jack finally broke the silence. "All right, kid," he said. "It's time to tell me the whole truth." She looked up at him, her face unreadable. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, she said, "I am not the last of my kind." Jack felt his stomach tighten. "What?" She exhaled, wrapping her arms around herself. "My people." She hesitated. "They are coming." Jack's mouth went dry. The ships they had seen earlier. The ones in the sky. They weren't here to save her. They were here to find her. Jack took a slow step closer. "Why?" She swallowed hard, looking away. "Because I am." She hesitated, her fingers clenching into fists. And then she finally said it. "Because I am their weapon." Jack's pulse stopped. The realization hit him like a freight train. She wasn't a refugee. She wasn't running from the hunters. She was running from her own people. Because she wasn't just one of them. She was something more. Something they had built. Something they had lost control of. And now, they wanted her back. Jack exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. He should walk away. This was too big, too dangerous. But as he looked at the girl, this scared, powerful, brilliant kid who had been fighting to survive every step of the way, he knew the truth. He wasn't going anywhere. Jack slung his shotgun over his shoulder. "All right, kid," he muttered. "We've got one hell of a problem." The girl looked up at him, eyes filled with something Jack couldn't quite place. Hope. Jack smirked. "Let's solve it." Above them, in the distant sky, the first of the alien warships began to descend. The arrival. Jack had seen war before. He had seen men reduced to dust by explosions, had heard the screams of the dying on battlefields he wished he could forget. He had fought, killed, and survived more times than he could count. But this wasn't war. This was annihilation. The sky above them split apart, a chasm of burning light cutting through the darkness. Jack and the girl stood on the rocky hilltop, staring up at the impossible sight unfolding before them. The first warship descended like a falling god. It wasn't like human ships. It had no wings, no engines, just a massive, smooth body that shifted and pulsed like something alive. Light rippled across its surface like liquid metal, and the very air around it hummed with power. Then came the others. One by one, They'd broke through the atmosphere, their massive forms blotting out the stars. Jack clenched his jaw. "Tell me you have a plan, kid." The girl didn't answer. Her glowing eyes were fixed on the ships above. Because she knew what was coming next. And so did Jack. A choice in the darkness. The ships hovered, silent, watching. Then, a beam of pure white light shot down, carving a perfect circle in the earth just ahead of them. And from the light, they emerged. Not the hunters. Something worse. They looked human. Almost. But their faces were too smooth, their movements too precise, their skin too perfect. Their eyes, however, they were the same as hers. Glowing. Burning with the same energy that flowed through the girl's veins. Jack raised his shotgun instinctively. "Friends of yours?" The girl shook her head. "No." The figures stepped forward as one, their boots making no sound on the dirt. Then, the tallest among them spoke. His voice was pure steel, smooth and commanding. "Return to us." Jack tightened his grip on the gun. "Yeah, see. I don't think she wants to go with you." The figure didn't even glance at him. It spoke only to the girl. "You belong to us." Jack took a slow step in front of her, shielding her with his body. The girl's hands clenched into fists. Her veins pulsed brighter. "I don't belong to anyone," she whispered. The tallest figure cocked its head. Then, in a tone that was almost disappointed, it said, "Then we will take you by force." And the battle began. The last stand. Jack barely had time to react before the ground erupted beneath them. The first soldier lunged. Jack fired. Point-blank blast to the chest. The thing didn't even slow down. The bullet ripped through its body, but instead of flesh and bone, it was made of something else. Something that shifted and reformed almost instantly. Jack barely had time to curse before the thing grabbed his throat. It lifted him off the ground. His vision blurred. The pressure was immense. He couldn't breathe. Then, boom. The soldier exploded into dust. Jack hit the ground hard, coughing. He turned just in time to see the girl standing there, her hands crackling with energy. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't running. She was fighting. More soldiers rushed forward, but the girl raised her hands. And the sky itself screamed. A pulse of white-hot energy tore through the battlefield, sending soldiers flying like ragdolls. Jack rolled to his feet, heart pounding. "I really hope you can do that more than once." She exhaled sharply. Her hands were shaking. She was powerful, but not invincible. And there were still more of them. Then, Jack heard it. The second wave was coming. And this time, they weren't sending foot soldiers. The warships shifted, their glowing underbellies opening like the petals of some mechanical flower. Jack's gut twisted. Something was about to come out. Something big. The girl staggered beside him. Her light was flickering. She was running out of strength. Jack swallowed hard. They weren't going to win this fight. Not by force. And then he had an idea. A stupid, reckless, impossible idea. But it was the only chance they had. The gamble. Jack grabbed the girl's wrist. "Hey, can you talk to them?" She looked at him in confusion. "What?" He pointed at the warships. "I don't mean these guys. I mean the whole damn fleet. Can you?" "I don't know. Send a message." She hesitated. Maybe. But why?" Jack grinned. "Because I've got a bet to make." The girl's eyes flickered with understanding. Then, without another word, she closed her eyes. Jack turned back to the battlefield, gripping his shotgun. He didn't know if this was going to work. But if he was going down, he was going down swinging. Then, the sky changed. The ships paused. The figures on the ground froze in place. And for the first time since this nightmare started, a new voice echoed through Jack's head. "Who are you?" Jack exhaled. Good. They were listening. "I'm just an old man," he said. "But I think you all have the wrong idea." Silence. Jack continued. "You're hunting her because she's powerful. Because she could destroy you. That's why you want her back, isn't it? Still silence. Jack smirked. Well, I've got news for you. He glanced at the girl, who was watching him with wide eyes. She's not your weapon anymore. More silence. Then, a shift. The figures around them turned toward the warships. Something had changed. Then, the voice spoke again. Understood. And just like that, they left. One by one, the ships rose into the sky, their forms fading into the darkness. The soldiers vanished like smoke. And then, it was just the two of them, standing alone beneath the stars, the end of the road. Jack turned to the girl. You okay? She nodded. Jack smirked. That was some damn fine work, kid. She stared at him for a long moment. Then, softly, she said, Thank you. Jack exhaled. So, what now? She looked up at the empty sky, and for the first time in a long, long while, she smiled.